The road narrowed as it climbed, a dark ribbon of mud and stubborn stones that had seen too many boots in too short a time. The trees pressed close, the boughs so heavy with last night's frost that a careless shake could loose a sparkling curtain to rattle down cloak and collar. When the wind found him, it found the seam under his jaw and slid cold fingers inside, down past wool and leather to his bones. He tightened his scarf as best he could with one hand and let the horse pick the path. The animal's breath came white and steady. The sky had the color of old pewter, a dull light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They had ridden since dawn. Dawn was a pale word this far north, a kind of lifting of the dark rather than a true beginning, and the man leading them, thin, hatchet-faced, the black of the watch hanging loose on a frame no tailor had ever learned, kept his thoughts to himself. Behind Jaime came 4 more brothers on sawboned geldings and 1 bald pack mule whose tail flicked occasionally as if to swat away the cold. The mule's panniers creaked in the silence, and once in a while a wooden ladle knocked against a pot with a weary cluck, as if reminding them the world still held ordinary things. The stump throbbed inside its glove. Some days it was a background ache, like an unwelcome rumor you could mostly ignore. Today the cold made it a bell you could not stop hearing. He had taught himself not to grimace, but he did glance down from time to time, because it was still a wonder to him how neat the leatherworker had been. A tight sheath, black as a priest's humor, laced to a strap that crossed his chest. The glove done so cunningly you might almost be fooled from a distance. It made people look twice, and that was better than the first reflexive pity. A crow dropped from a branch and kept pace a few seconds, wing beats more sound than sight in the air. Another took off to join it, and then both slid between trunks to vanish. Jaime breathed and let the taste of pine and iron stay on his tongue. The smell of horse, old smoke and wool, the sour of stale bread they had eaten in saddles that morning, the common, dull litany of traveling. He preferred it. He had had his fill of bright halls and clever smiles. The woods did not care who he had been. The woods did not expect him to be better than he was. "I'd have camped sooner," the lead brother said at last, voice low as if they were inside a church. "But there's a hollow ahead with a stream and a rock face to break the wind. The deer have had it first. We'll make do." Jaime lifted his chin. "I've slept with worse companions than deer, and woken with less of your coin," one of the others muttered, to a little laugh that flared and died just as fast. The hatchet-faced brother didn't rebuke them or smile. He'd been introduced as Ulmer, and if he had once had a surname it had sloughed off like bark. They rode on. The hollow was as promised, a scooped place in the earth worn by water and feet. The stream talked to itself under a skin of ice no thicker than a fingernail, and the rock face wore a beard of moss now gone brown with the season. Ulmer unslung his bedroll, then his hatchet, and set to wood. Jaime's horse sidled once and snorted. The mule stood as if carved. Work had its own grammar. The brothers fell to it easily, one coaxing coals from last year's ash that some ranger had left under a stone, another laying kindling, 2 more gathering the driest branches they could find. Jaime crouched near the old fire pit and laid out bread, a heel of cheese, and the salted meat Hob the cook in that last inn had insisted on pushing into his satchel with a wicked grin. He cut with his left hand. The knife felt familiar and wrong at once, like wearing someone else's boot and making it serve. His first slices were too thick. No one said a word. He thinned the next ones and did not hurry. A hush took them as the fire found its breath. Heat moved across his face like a hand. Ulmer came to sit and pulled his gloves off finger by finger, revealing hands scarred into maps. They ate without talking. The meat was as hard as he'd expected, and the cheese had given up on the notion of softness, but the bread was decent enough. Jaime chewed and watched the flames. He had served noble tables where a boar's flank would be borne in under silver and honey would drip down knives. The memory made his teeth ache. It felt both far and somehow indecent to recall it. When they had eaten, Ulmer poured a little from his flask into a tin cup and handed it down the line. When it reached Jaime, he lifted it and smelled pepper and something harsh. He drank. The heat dropped into him quick as a thrown stone into a well. "You'll say the words soon," Ulmer said. "The old way. We've time if you want it. That's all I'm set to tell you." Time is all I've had, Jaime said, then thought how that sounded and added, I'll say them as the watch says them. Ulmer looked into his face a while, the way you might gauge a horse for a journey. It matters that you understand. It's not a clean shirt to put on after the last one has turned. It's a new skin. You don't get to keep the old scars as proof of who you were. I don't need scars to prove it. He flexed the glove. My ghosts still know me by name. The others stirred at that, not in challenge but like men at a fire that has flared higher than they expected. Ulmer tipped his head once, as if conceding some point to the air between them, and stood. They had another hour of gray daylight left. They spent it in small necessities that push big thoughts aside. Ulmer sent two with the mule to fetch more wood before true dark settled. A boy? He could not be more than 16 and still had the softened features of a childhood not yet kicked entirely out of him. Took the tin pot and the ladle to the stream. He cracked the ice with the handle and scooped water, set it by the fire with a gravity that did not emit laughter. One of the oldest men, bald with a fuzz of white that clung stubbornly to the rim of his skull, began to stitch at a torn seam in his glove with a boar's bristle hung about his neck. His tongue peeked out the corner of his mouth as he guided it through the leather. As the sky drained to slate, the wind turned and slid down the hollow with a sigh. The brothers rolled into their blankets and their shapes turned anonymous. Someone began to snore almost at once, an irregular thing like a saw catching. Jaime lay on his back with his cloak tight around his throat and watched the thin smoke lift and flatten. He kept his eyes open until the first stars found each other and made patterns older than any king, then let them close and joined the dark. He dreamed of a hallway with wet stones and a sword that weighed nothing and everything at once. He dreamed of doors with no hinges and a song made of teeth. He woke with his mouth full of the taste of coins. The boy was tending the embers, careful as a priest, cheeks blown bright by his breath. When he saw Jaime's eyes, he looked quickly away as if he had been caught doing a wrong thing. "What's your name?" Jaime asked, his voice coming rough from sleep. "Darren," the boy said to the fire. "How far have you come, Darren?" The boy licked his lips. "Far enough that my mother's voice is thinner than a thread in my head now." He turned the stick and coaxed flame from glow. "From White Harbor to here, then beyond here." "And why?" Darren's shoulders shifted. He still did not look up. Why does a boy do anything? Because he ran too fast one night when his feet should have stayed still. The answer came so pat and flat it had the feel of something learned and repeated until it had ceased to be himself. Jaime recognized the trick by which one could say a thing and keep it from bleeding. "Did you steal?" Jaime asked gently. "I ran," Darren said, and then the boy looked at him directly, as if this much deserved eye contact. "And I keep running. The wall is a kind of stopping, they say. So I ran that way." Jaime thought of other kinds of running, the ones where your legs were still, the ones where you ran through rooms by way of a cunning smile, with words held in front of you like shields. He thought that stops were dangerous places. He turned onto his side and watched the snow begin to come down. It made no sound. It merely accepted the world it fell on and laid itself over it. They reached the keep the next day, when the light was thin and honest. The trees fell away in a final sullen line, and the road sank between hills whose grasses had a faint gray to them, as if mourning. Then the wall came into view. It always came as a shock, even to those who had expected something imposing. To Jaime it felt like a cliff the world had grown by mistake, like the edge of a page left unturned for too long. It robbed the wind of words. It robbed you of your own scale. Men who had stood in front of kings and called them great had to bite their tongues not to call this a god. Castle Black crouched against it like a dog with one eye empty. Timber and stone, patched and pragmatic. Smoke rose from two chimneys and sheathed itself against the ice before being shunted sideways by a stray gust. The yard was full of work, the kind that did not prepare itself for ceremonial arrivals. Nothing stopped. Men moved with bundles of kindling and bolts of rough cloth. A boy led a shaggy goat with its mind elsewhere. In the shadow of the wall, near the winch for the lift, 3 figures bent to a sled and grunted as they hauled it forward, the runners screaming against packed snow. Ulmer gave a nod that was not quite a bow to the man who came to meet them. The man wore black like the rest, but with a fur collar that had seen more careful brushing. He had a northerner's face, all cuts and plains, but there was an air to him like a ledger balanced daily. "Bowen," Ulmer said. The man glanced down the line, taking in horses, mule, faces. He did not linger on Jaime any longer than on the mule. "Ulmer." His voice had nothing in it of welcome and nothing of refusal. It was a slot cut carefully for the work of an hour. "We've one to say the words," Ulmer said. Bowen Marsh's gaze landed on Jaime again and stayed one heartbeat longer. If he knew the name, he did not let it show. That was a kindness of a sort and also a policy. "You'll have them the old way? The gods pass the gate," Ulmer said. He turned to Jaime. "You wish it so?" Jaime looked up at the wall. He did not feel anything like courage or despair. He felt only that he had arrived at the place the road had chosen for him. "Yes. Good." Bowen nodded once, the gesture proving sincerity by its economy. "Ulmer, take your recruits to the armory. Hobbs got stew that offends but doesn't kill. We're short on hands. I'll take what help you can give. You," he said to Jaime in a softer tone. He might have used with any man about to bind himself to something he could not later cut off. "Eat and warm yourself. The wood beyond the gate won't grant you that." "I'll take both here," Jaime said, and was rewarded with the tiniest pull at one corner of Bowen's mouth. If it was not a smile, it was at least an acknowledgement of the notion of one. They stabled the horses, and Jaime's mount looked back at him with a long stare that was almost a reproach. He put his good hand along the animal's neck and pressed, then let the boy with the goat's rope take the reins. The stables smelled of ammoniac comfort. He could have stood there for an hour just to be where another breathing thing stood and did not ask him anything. The armory was a cavern of iron and smoke. A burly man at the forge, black beard trimmed to a rough-looking care, one sleeve pinned and empty, glanced at the arrivals and said nothing. He was hammering a nail the size of a finger flat. The sound rang honest and then was swallowed by the stone. He slid the iron eye into the coals and turned, and that was when Jaime saw the man's odd grace. The forge had claimed his right arm above the elbow, or a battle had. You could not tell by sight which. He held his hammer in the left. The movements were economical, unpitiful. He did not waste his limited balance on theatrics. "You'll need a blade you can't sing about," the man said when the hammer rested and the iron glowed and he had a moment to afford speech. "Names draw attention out there. Best to have a thing you can forget in the mud and not mourn." He did not offer a hand, and Jaime did not push his glove up to show the stump. He had learned that sometimes mercy was to spare people the shape of your wound. "Hop stew?" Ulmer said, and tipped his head toward a doorway beyond which someone was swearing gently about onions. "Then the lift. We've a gray day and I'd as soon spend its last coins in the godswood when it's still borrowing light." Jaime followed the smell of broth. The kitchen was less a room than a clot of controlled chaos. A man with shoulders like a sow's back stirred a cauldron, face glistening and serene. He had a song without words in his throat that went on whether anyone listened or not. He saw Jaime, set his spoon aside, and dabbed his brow with a cloth that had once been white. "You're thin," he announced, as if this were Jaime's worst fault. "Well, there's time to fix that." He ladled stew into a wooden bowl until it overflowed, then tipped some back out with a look like a banker adjusting an account. "There, Justice. Don't burn your tongue trying to prove you're tough." Jaime could have wept at the smell of it. It was onions indeed, and barley and a few honest carrots and something that had once moved over hills. He took the spoon and ate. The heat made him aware of every hair in his beard. The taste was better than it needed to be. Hobb watched with a proprietary pride and a gambler's eye, measuring by the speed with which a man took his second bite what kind of man he might be. When the bowl was empty, Hobb took it from him before he could think of politeness and thrust a heel of bread into his hand unasked. "You'll want that when the wind begins to teach you your lessons," he said. "Scholar of the chill, this one will be." They went to the lift then. The great machine was all ropes and iron teeth. It looked as if it should complain, and it did. Men set their backs to capstans and the platform rose, taking with it their groans and breaths. Jaime stood at the edge. He did not feel dizzy as the yard fell away and the world spread. He felt smaller only, and that was not entirely a discomfort. The wall from here was less a thing and more a place. It had its own climate, its own rules. The wind at the top was a living thing that seemed to whistle past the sutures of the earth. There was a gate beyond the topmost rampart, a door set into ice that could have been a trick of the eye until you saw the thick iron studs and the shaved wood that fought to refuse the cold. They pushed it open and stepped onto a narrow path cut along the far edge. The air there was different, sharper, threaded with something metallic. Jaime tasted it and thought of a sword licked in winter. The gods would hear was no lord's garden. It was a thicket of old trees bent with snow and grievance, the ground uneven, the silence deepening into a presence. They found the clearing where the heart tree waited. Its bark was pale, irrationally so, as if a woman's skin had been borrowed and wrapped around a trunk. The face carved there was the kind of sorrow that has forgotten itself. Its mouth gaped a little as if to take a breath it did not require. In that breathless place, even Ulmer's flat face softened. "Here," he said, and stepped back, as if making room for something he could not see. Jaime stood before the tree as he had stood before 1,000 people. He waited for anger to seize him, for pride to stiffen his neck, for contempt to give him someplace high to stand. All that came was a quiet he had not expected and did not like. To bind himself here did not feel like cleverness or theater. It felt like putting down a sword you had in your hand after a night of holding it because you feared what would happen if you let go. He spoke the words as the watch had taught them, though he changed some in his mouth as if carving a thing to fit his own hand. He vowed what needed vowing, that he would take no wife, father no child, hold no lands, wear no crowns, not because those things were beneath him, but because he was beneath the need to make exceptions for himself. He promised to guard and to stand, to give his body to a cold that did not care about the flag on a standard, to make his nights belong to men who snored and lied to one another about courage, and to a wind that stripped faces of titles. He said the words and felt them as a weight in his chest, like a bar laid there by a blacksmith. He had sworn vows before. He had broken them before. This vow did not feel like a rope around his neck. It felt like a step taken away from the edge of something. The face in the tree did not move. The snow went on with its steady accounting of the world. Ulmer stepped forward and put his hand not on Jaime's shoulder but near it, a gesture that acknowledged the idea and not the flesh. "So you've said it," he said. "Now the work." The work began in small and humiliating ways. The next morning he woke to a horn and built his bed again from the floor up because something in him demanded civilized order even when the mattress was straw. He folded his blanket with a care that would have made some steward proud if any such person had been watching. Darren, who had been given over to the builders, lurched by the door with a sack of nails over his back like an old man too stubborn to admit he should die. "You'll be at the ranges," Ulmer said, when Jaime reported as told. "Don't grin. The bows will teach your left hand to listen. And we have a use for eyes that have measured distance with their own lives." Ulmer's mouth flicked again in almost smile. "You can aim. I can see that in the way you stand. You'll be a poor archer and a patient man, which is to say a good brother." The ranges were set against a berm behind the stables, a long bite taken out of the earth. The targets were straw wrapped tight with rope and patched so often they had the look of veterans. Jaime took a bow. The bow was tall as his chest, the string firm. He had always enjoyed bows in a casual way, as a nobleman enjoys falconry, a practiced leisure with an end in glory. This was not a pastime. This was medicine for a wounded limb. He did what the old sergeant teaching the range did not bother to say. Felt for the way his body wanted badly to remember the old path and forced it down a new one. The stance mattered. The hand, the shoulder, the breath. The first 30 arrows went where they wanted. The 31st struck the outer ring, close enough that he might have pretended it was the second ring if nobody else had been there. The sergeant, a man with a nose broken long ago and badly set, made no sound of approval. He stood like a stake and watched. Jaime did not count after that. He felt the bow instead. The string bruising young nerves, the wooden grip rough against a palm that had to learn the language of friction again. The way his left forearm wanted to do too much and had to be eased back into its place. He stopped only when the world had narrowed to a line and the line had narrowed to breath. Then he lifted his head and saw frost on his sleeve and the world invented once more in front of him. "You might make a man yet," the sergeant said, as if he had reported that a wall was straight after a winter had tried to tilt it. "Drop your shoulder. You fly right because you twist. Untwist. Untwist," Jaime repeated softly, as if the word were a charm against what else in him was knotted. He found the stables when his fingers needed warmth, and the horses leaned hot air into his face and let him stand a while like any man who had come for nothing and found it. He learned names. Not the names of the animals, those the boys had that were too grand and too silly by turns, but the names of the work itself, the dull words that can underpin a life. He learned which plank in the walkway liked to turn an ankle, which stone held a puddle long after the day's thaw, which rasp hob used to make a block of salted beef give up on its ambitions to kill a man's teeth, which rag someone had hung to dry and which had been left to freeze. He was sent with the builders one morning to help tie off new windbreaks over the outer latrines, a job the wind did not appreciate. He stood with rope in his teeth and his good hand braced and the glove that hid his stump pressed hard into raw wood. One of the men with him was the bald elder whose glove had needed sewing. He had a stubborn look that was also gentle. "I'm Mudge," the man said when a gust subsided enough to allow an introduction. "Not that it matters. Men don't remember names when the wind's about. They remember who held and who let go." "Jaime," he said, and the name came out plain, not as something that had once been followed by a title like a dog. He watched Mudge's eyes and saw the recognition ripple and then settle away like a fish deciding to keep to deeper water. It was not ignorance. It was a choice to let him be one of 1,000 Jaimes north of Pines. The kindness of it stung more than suspicion would have. "Keep your knot clean," Mudge advised, indicating the rope. "No loops waiting to be mischief. The wind likes to take an invitation so subtle you don't see it as one. You tie with enough malice to deny it the chance to pretend it was clever." They wrestled the windbreak into place and stood looking at it with the same satisfaction men who build cathedrals must feel, which is to say simple relief that a thing stands at all. Something about this man was unsettling in a tender way, like finding a letter you had written as a child. Ser Jaime. The title came out because it was a habit. He had not meant it to. He grimaced and started to correct himself, but the old man lifted a hand. "Don't scrape away the word too roughly," he said. "Titles are like old paint. You remove them and find other colors underneath. Is the wood happier bare? Perhaps. Perhaps not. It's all wood still." His blindness tilted toward where Jaime's voice was. "Forgive me. I have known too many men and not enough nights. I am Eamon." "I know your name," Jaime said, because everyone did who had listened in hallways. "I didn't expect," he stopped. The old man waited kindly for him to fit one sentence to the next. "I didn't expect you to feel like a knife in a sheath," Jaime finished, hoping that did not sound mad. "Sharp, quiet." Eamon's smile deepened. "We do not get to choose what we mean to others. We only get to choose to clean our blade and keep it where it harms least." His hands continued with their task. He was polishing a piece of metal so small it could be a ring or part of a clasp. "You are in pain," he added in the same tone a man might observe that the weather threatened rain. "Yes," Jaime said. He did not make it a confession. He made it a fact. "Good," Eamon said, so mild he could have been approving of a nicely cut plank. "Pain is a tutor who does not waste time on students who do not listen. There are other tutors here. Cold, hunger, waiting. They are incompetent if they have you only briefly, but keep their company long enough you cannot remain a fool." "I've kept the company of cleverness," Jaime said. "It did not make me wise." "Cleverness and wisdom sit at opposite ends of a bench," Eamon said. "One sees the knot's cleverness, the other the rope's strength. Both have their place, but you cannot pretend one can replace the other." He tilted his head slightly. "Your hand," Jaime didn't look at the glove. It is gone. So is much else. I meant, Jaime said, and then stopped. Yes, much else. Eamon moved to put the polished piece aside as tenderly as if it were a piece of fruit that would bruise at a look. Tell me of your ghosts. Do they shout or whisper? They don't speak, Jaime said. They are patient. They stand and watch. And sometimes they shake their heads. Even the patient ones want something, Eamon said. Do they want your apology? They want me to look where I wouldn't, he said. He did not know until he said it. The walls of the rookery seemed to lean closer to hear him and then leaned back again with a dry chuckle, like old men agreeing over some game. They want me to stand somewhere I cannot make excuses from. Eamon breathed a small assent. Good, he said again. There is a chair in the rookery you may sit in when the wind is too much and you must read your letters. You will have letters. You should decide now which among them you will read. He did not say what letters. He did not need to. Jaime felt the knot in his chest pull tight until it was a clean line. I will read the ones that make me stand taller, he said, and did not add that he would burn the others after not sleeping a whole night each time they arrived. He suspected Eamon already knew. The letter came 3 days later, as if the bird had been flying while Eamon spoke, black wings beating a rhythm as sure as a drummer calling march. It arrived in Bowen's hand, who did not read the seal but could have guessed more than Jaime wanted him to. Bowen's voice had the neutrality of an accountant balancing an unpleasant account. There is a message for you in the rookery, he said only. Eamon asked that I tell you. Jaime climbed the stairs and stood with his palm against the door a heartbeat before entering. Eamon was there, his head turned slightly toward the sound of the steps, the room full of the quiet arrogance of ravens, the world's most stubborn choir. On the table sat the rolled parchment. The seal was distorted from the bird's carry. The gold wax wanted the room to bow to it. It would not get its wish here. He did not have to break it to know what it would say. He did not know the exact sentences. He knew the shape of the trap. You've no obligation to let it in, Eamon said, simply offering a fact. A man may choose what voices he houses. I know. He cracked the wax with his thumb. The scent that came up was faintly of some perfume that had been spilled into drawers at some point years ago. He read it. The room did not tilt. He read it again. Then he held it over the small brazier Eamon kept for wax work and watched the flame take the bottom edge almost politely. A curl of smoke lifted that would smell to no one but him like a certain hall on a summer afternoon when he had been young enough to think summer was the law and not a brief benevolence. He let the fire have it. He let his hand warm. Eamon did not nod, did not say a wise thing. The old man's fingers found a scrap of leather on the table and smoothed it until it lay perfectly flat. He trained as if he had never trained at anything. Seriousness had been his mask all his life. Now he found that when you put it on and meant it, it fit differently. He learned to fight left-handed because a boy with a cudgel and mercy in his eyes taught him to. The boy's name was Tam. Tam had the particular cruelty of the truly kind, pushing Jaime until something in the older man flew loose, and then waiting calmly until it came back and settled in a better position. Your feet still think like your right hand, Tam said, not apologetic, as he put his wooden practice sword against Jaime's with a clap of wood to wood that echoed in the yard. You keep stepping as if the floor will remember. Teach it again. 1 inch further away. No, not the foot. The hip. It begins at the hip. Your body is smarter than your mouth. Listen to it. Days tallied themselves. The snow deepened and had its own moods he had not known existed. Powder light as mockery and heavy wet that clung to wool like a cloying guest. The wind came from the east some days, bringing with it a brillo of salt that must have been a memory from the sea. Other days it fell from the north as from a starless roof, meek and remorseless both, sanding skin to what lay beneath. He learned to love the way the wall's shadow crept and retreated like a tide that could not make up its mind. In that shadow he sometimes saw his old life flicker like a candle seen through a bottle. The bottle made a different shape of it. He was grateful to the glass. He went beyond the gate the first time as part of a small party given a dull task that would be dull only to the kind of man who had not learned the basic pleasure of being set to a job and doing it as asked. a forage for deadfalls and for the dried lichens that Hob claimed he could coax into soup when true winter bit. They walked in a line that was not strictly straight, feeling the ground more than measuring it. The forest beyond the wall was neither haunted nor benign. It was a large house with many rooms, and they had to conduct themselves as guests. Once, a fox crossed their path and paused. Its tail was a banner not of a kingdom but of itself, arrogant and elegant. It considered them with a coolness that said men were a noise it tolerated. And then it was gone. Darren saw it too, pointed, then dropped his hand as if he feared the gesture might offend. At midday, Ulmer called a halt, and they squatted by a fallen oak with bark chewed at by something hungry. Jaime chewed cold bread and eyed the pattern in the bark as if it might tell him a joke if he stared long enough. Tam leaned back, used the trunk as support, and closed his eyes in that practice of soldiers who know to find sleep anywhere as if it were a rabbit to be snared, quiet and sudden. "Some of the trees here are older than lies," Mudge said, as if continuing a conversation with another day. "A man can say anything in front of them and they won't bother to listen. You might as well say it all. Costs you less than keeping it." "What would I say?" Jaime asked, tasting a dare in his own voice. Mudge shrugged. "Say you were proud and it did you harm. That's most of us. Say you mistook cleverness for strength. Say you loved and that made you stupid, which is the only kind of stupidity I admire." "I was proud," Jaime said to the tree, feeling foolish and therefore honest. "And I mistook a thing for the whole of the world because of how it made my blood move." Tam cracked one eye open. "Everyone does. They write songs about it so they can pretend it was less ordinary than it was. Songs are lies meant to keep us hopeful. And to make someone coin," Mudge grunted. "They made their way back with sacks the weight of good deeds. The gate swallowed them with the relief a house swallows a family when rain has done its worst. Hob made a pot of something that had the rare quality of being sweeter at the bottom than the top, as if gravity had been kind to the honey the man claimed he could coax from bark. Men told small stories that asked nothing of the listener but attention. Derek, the boy, laughed at something dumb with the laugh of someone who thought he had forgotten how to laugh like that. Night came like a sheet pulled up slowly over a sick man. Jaime lay on his back, again at that place where a man's body registers discomfort before his mind can name it. He was tired to the tendons. He closed his eyes and saw not the things he had done wrong, but the particular angle of Tam's wrist as he had blocked a blow that afternoon. He slept and dreamed again, but this time it was of small things. A bowl's rim chipped in a scallop, a seam on his glove that he had to repair if he didn't want his fingers to blister, the sound of a raven slipping its ringed foot against its perch as if a woman had shushed it in a chamber. He woke happier than he deserved. The yard in the mornings grew familiar enough that his feet found the best routes without consultation. He learned which group of men would bruise him in practice and then laugh with him after, and which would bruise him in practice and then avoid his eye at the meal. He sought the first. He learned that Darren could throw a small blade with wicked accuracy, a skill the boy had acquired when rats in White Harbor had made a game of stealing crumbs right beneath his hand. He learned that Mudge had a wife somewhere he had left 20 years past and sometimes sent her his wages in the shape of trinkets Hob made him in idle moments. Dull spoons and charms with badly carved birds on them, as if apology could be made into an object. He learned that Tam had once held a wall with 12 men and lost 8 and counted himself lucky because he had learned there was a number less than 12 and not 0. Once he woke before the horn. He lay and listened. The watch had a particular silence at that hour. It is the silence of men whose breath has become communal, as if the stable and the dormitory and the old stores had agreed to share one lung for a while. He was almost reluctant to break it, but habit and that new seriousness, no longer a mask, moved him. He took his practice sword and went to a corner of the yard where the shadow of the keep lay like a blessing. He moved through drills he had watched boys do 100 times and mocked them for doing. Simple patterns, the figure 8 that grows boring and then reveals itself, the step that moves not the foot but the center line. He was not alone for long. Tam came, and then a man whose name he did not know, and then Darren, holding his practice blade as if it were a fishing pole he had to learn not to whip. No one spoke. They moved, and the only sound was the scuff of boots and the quiet grunt when someone found the core of an exercise, and for a heartbeat it felt like falling through a hole into a clean pool. Later, as he drank hot broth in the kitchen, Hob asked him, "Do you miss it?" "What?" "Being the most important man in the room half the time and the most dangerous the other half." Jaime examined the curve of steam off his cup. "I miss that everyone knew the rules," he said. "Even the treacherous ones. Up here the rules are simpler, but they feel more like weather. You don't argue with weather. You just become wet or find a roof." "You always could find roofs," Hob said. "Some men find roofs. Others are the roof. The rest of us just keep our bowls out of the rain when we can." He leaned in slightly conspirator. "I made a cake once, for a feast in a lord's hall. They sang of it in 3 counties. I stood behind a curtain while they sang about my cake. Imagine being known for something that is eaten. Imagine being the thing that disappears. I liked it more than I should. It made me less angry now when no one knows my name." Jaime thought about being eaten and did not, for once, think of wolves. He thought of how a thing could be complete at the moment it vanishes. He thought that perhaps sometimes vanishing was the right end of a labor. He thought of a letter turned to ash. He saw Jon Snow for the first time not as a hero, not as the shape of all the stories some of the younger men had started to shape around him in whispers, but as a man coming down 3 stairs at once because someone had called his name and he was in the habit of moving quickly for those who called. There is a humility in swiftness no one writes about. Jon's hair was tied back badly. His eyes were focused on whoever had said his name rather than on anything he might pass by. He reached the bottom of the stairs and listened to a boy who had the panicked look of someone whose task had run faster than his legs. "You'll take a turn?" Bowen asked him 10 minutes later, tone mild but with a prickle at the edges. "We need a clear head on the wall." "I'll take 2, Jon said, as if it were what anyone would answer. His glance slid past Jaime, not in disdain but because so many eyes had to be met in a day. He could not afford the luxury of significance. "Ulmer," he said, catching the older brother's sleeve as if he had been looking for him since dawn. "The south gate's frozen at the northern hinge. You know that trick with boiling water? You mean the trick where we burn ourselves and feel like fools?" "I know it," Ulmer said. The two went off toward the yard with a quick exchange of hand signs like fishermen. Jon passed Jaime then within arm's reach. It would have been easy to speak his name and let it drop with the weight of what it meant. Jaime did not. He did not yet know whether his voice would help or harm, and here you learned quickly that sometimes the kindest thing you could do in a day was to mind what harm you might bring by accident. He watched Jon make a quick turn and speak to a group of 3, then to Hob, then to Bowen. There was a way men moved around Jon that said they resented and relied on him in equal measure. It is a miserable privilege to be that man. Later their eyes found each other over the rim of a bowl in Hob's domain. Jon's gaze stopped. Men's eyes had been doing that to Jaime his whole life. Sometimes because they knew him, more often because they suspected him to be someone worth knowing. This stop was different. It had curiosity in it and caution, and a kind of grief that had become architecture inside a person. "You came north," Jon said, almost to himself, as if reporting the weather to a ledger. "I did." Jaime did not add anything like explanation. Jon raised one eyebrow the slightest amount that asked for truth and was ready for lies, and then inclined his head once. That was all. It was enough. Jaime went back to the ranges that afternoon and found the day's light stubborn as a mule but there to be made use of. He drew and breathed and loosed and corrected his shoulder again. The sergeant grunted once when an arrow made the far ring hum. It was praise of a kind. He would have worked until the light made fools of them if the horn had not sounded once from the wall. The sound was not alarm. It was not the old panic that had set men running with swords they were not ready to use. It was the long, carrying note of return, a tone threaded with relief. Rangers back. Jaime put the bow aside and let his feet carry him to the yard with everyone else. It is a particular pleasure to see men return in one piece. It is one of the pleasures that does not diminish with repetition. A party came through the open gate, 4 men and a litter between them. The litter bore a man wrapped to his chin, whose eyes were open and awake. He had a cut under one that would swell by morning. He grinned before the heavy door had closed. "You'll want to hear what's east of Long Barrow," he announced, cheerful as a drunk with news. "You'll want to hear how the trees have learned to move. You'll want hot wine and a basin of water first," Bowen said, as if he was a parent hauling a boy away from the cliff edge back to his laundry. The yard laughed the way yards do when no one has died. The litter-bearers set their burden down with a care that made it formal. That kind of gentleness is prize enough for any man. Darren stood on toes he thought no one noticed to see over shoulders. Hobbs' assistant, a girl from the Molestown kitchens who had decided her chances of honest boredom were better above ground, clapped once quietly and then caught herself. Jaime watched with a kind of hunger that did not have a name. He wanted to be the man on the litter. He wanted to be the man holding the litter. He wanted to be the man making soup for them. He wanted to be the man who had not yet heard the story and was about to. He was all and none of those men. He was, at least, a man in the yard who would sleep that night knowing someone had come home and that he had done a small part in making the place seen as home. In the days that followed, he was given turn at the top of the wall, standing behind the crenellations and letting his eyes do the work that arms might no longer be the quickest to. There is a way the light plays on the snow fields that will trick even a wise man into seeing movement where there is none and then shrug when true motion passes as if it were a thought. He learned to use the edge of his sight, not the center. He learned to watch shadows rather than sources. He learned to take a measure of the day's wind by the way the ravens circled and by how the pines beyond the gate were stroked to fur by it. Sometimes he stood with a man named Boric, who kept a piece of dried apple tucked in his cheek like a secret he refused to share with the air. Boric had the kind of humor a hill has, slow, inevitable, kind to the sober and dangerous to the careless. Once Boric said, without preamble, "I killed a man for taking my sister's ribbon. I was 12. What color was the ribbon?" "Red." Boric swished the apple in his cheek to a better angle. "She used it to tie her hair, and I thought that made our mother come back from the grave. It did not. Does your sister wear ribbons now? She sells them in a stall in the market when the roads are kind to caravans. She touches them less than she thought she would. The touching spoils them. She learned that some beauties are for the eye alone." Boric glanced sideways at Jaime. "And you?" "I killed a king to keep a city from fire." Boric chewed once and swallowed. "They didn't give you a ribbon for that." "No. Men are fools. But they're consistent. I prefer the honest fools." "So do I." "Then you'll do." Boric took the apple from his cheek, glanced at it as if it had betrayed him by being smaller than he remembered, and tucked it away again. "You'll do for this wall. The wall accepts men who do not explain themselves at all hours." In the quiet that came then, Jaime let his gaze move with professional laziness across the blank beyond. He was a guard again, a simple function, an eye set where an eye was needed. It was a relief so pure he felt ridiculous for finding it profound. He stood and watched. He found the smallest shapes and counted them and did it again as if prayers could be made of observation. Night stretched. He learned the language of stars as any boy does who has to, which is to say he learned not their names but their uses. He learned how one bright cold thing can be used to find another bright cold thing, and by this unromantic practice a man can point his feet where his feet must go if he wants a roof to find him at the end of his effort. He learned which constellations hid behind cloud and which were brazen enough to stand their ground when weather bullied. He learned that even a blind man could speak of the stars wisely because the stars are more similar to vows than to jewels. Both are useful mostly because you do not always look directly at them. He dreamed on a third night of a hall and a woman with hair like poured ink who had a laugh that had been a weapon when he had first heard it and a prayer when he heard it again years later. He woke with the residue of the sound and then was ashamed. He went to the yard in the morning like a penitent and made himself do the drill with the figure 8 until his shoulder burned and the burn became a steady warmth and then faded into something like peace. Tam watched him finish and lifted his chin. "You don't have to punish yourself," Tam said with a compassion that made the words not sting. "I don't know how not to. Start with eating a second bowl. Small mercies before you aim at the larger ones." He did not argue. He ate a second bowl. The second bowl was very like forgiveness, because it required neither confession nor permission. It made his stomach feel like a friend. He had been at the wall long enough that the days had begun to resemble each other when the first odd thing happened. Not the kind of odd thing grandmothers tell in stories, with lights in the trees and sounds like bells under the earth. An oddness of manners. A man came through the gate from the south with a bundle under his arm that was not his. He was a merchant by his clothing, the kind of practical fabric that claims quality without taste. He asked for the armorer, which was ordinary. But he used a name when he asked that was not a name used here. "Is there a Donnell?" he asked, hat in hand. The armorer wiped his brow and raised an eyebrow with patience that had been sharpened on fools. "I can be any name you like if you hand me a broken hinge. Otherwise you'll call me Smith, and we'll shake hands with that between us. I had a cousin took a warhammer from a man by that name once," the merchant said, eyes sliding sideways to see how a story might float. "Said the thing hummed with luck. It hummed with good steel," the armorer said, not angry, merely the kind of tired that keeps a man short with nonsense. "And your hinge?" The merchant's smile let go. He produced the hinge and the conversation became about small angles and the way iron wants to remember the shape it was first taught. Jaime stood near the door and felt the oddness like a nail pressed to a palm. It was not the name itself. It was how easily the man had tried to put the past into present conversation without asking whether present men had use for it. You learn to survive that trick in court. You learn to be wary of it in kitchens. You learn to ignore it in the yard. Here, you learn to look at it as at a leak in a roof. It is not a disaster. It will ruin you if left. He mentioned it to Eamon later, not as anything urgent, but as if they were both watching a dog and trying to decide if it belonged to anyone. Eamon nodded slowly. "Names drift," he said. "Some come here to rest and die. Some come here to be born again. Many come here to hide and end up wearing themselves thin with the effort. Let names knock at your door. You need not open, but you should not pretend you did not hear." That night he lay awake and remembered being a lion by birth and a man by accident and an oathbreaker by necessity, and then he remembered a boy from White Harbor who had learned to throw knives at rats. The boy's laugh that evening had been something clean. He let that be the last thing his mind touched before sleep took the rest. He had expected, maybe secretly, that the wall would offer him a story so large he could hide inside it. Instead it offered him small days that required him to show up. He had his failures. He lost his temper once at a man with a head like a squash who had mocked Tam's patience in the yard. He used a voice he had promised himself he would not use, one that commanded by reminding rather than convincing. To shut the man up. It made the air filthy afterward. He apologized to Tam with the kind of gruffness men use when they are inexperienced at apologizing. Tam accepted with a nod. "We prickle when we change skins," he said. "It itches. Don't scratch where you bleed." There was the day he went beyond the wall again with Mudge and Darren and two others to gather wood at a copse that had been spared rangers' attentions by some quirk of angles. They found the place under a low ridge where wind had failed to bully the snow. They set to cutting and stacking, the work cheerful. The way a man's breath plumes when he is working with others and the sound of the axe becomes the measure of the hour like a bell. They found prints on the way back. Not fresh, not old enough to be Charity either. Barefoot. Mudge crouched and grunted in that way he had when something in the world had matched an old pattern in his head. "You'll want to make your hands look like you don't mind," he said to Darren without looking up. "And you," he added to Jaime, "will want to stop looking like you've seen ghosts. We might have and we might not. Either way, it doesn't help to startle stupid." They returned without incident, the gate swallowing them again, a kind of creature that eats fear and gives it back in the shape of stories later over bowls. They told Bowen. Bowen sent a pair out with a different pair to see if the walking thing had turned or kept straight. They returned as night fell. It had turned. It had walked in circles. Men made logical conclusions. Men made superstitious ones too. Both sets were kept in the same cupboard and taken out as needed. Jaime slept badly that night. He dreamed not of halls, not of vows, not of the kind of big errors that make a man dramatic in his own mind. He dreamed of a wolf dog he had seen once as a boy that had lost an ear, sitting in a yard with its head tilted, hearing something no human could. He woke with that picture and felt stupid for being moved by it. He went to the rookery with no reason and stood among the birds while they regarded him with their bright, vindictive eyes. "You have learned to be quiet inside," Eamon said from the table without turning. "It becomes you." "I don't know that I have learned it," Jaime said. "It may be a fad." Eamon laughed softly. "Fads demand a crowd. You have only the wind now." They stood together and, together, neither said anything else for a time that had no need to be measured. The ravens made the small movements of creatures who have their own business and trust no one with it. Through the window slit, the sky was a flat sheet of beat metal. One flake of snow floated by and then reconsidered, traveling in impossible ways as wind explained to it how the world truly worked. "I thought," Jaime said finally, "that I might find penance here in grand things, that I would be asked to die very nobly, that it would be the obvious price. And instead," Eamon asked, turning his face toward the sound of Jaime's voice, "instead I am asked to sweep a step when it snows," he said, and heard how even that phrase believed itself to be the hinge of a homily and wanted to be corrected. "It is humiliating to discover that this is harder." "Great sacrifices attract admirers," Eamon said. "Small duties attract no one. They break a man or make him decent. I don't know that decent is within my reach." He realized he did want to sound sorry and tamped down the note. "I can be useful." "It will do," Eamon said, his blind gaze as gentle as the hand of a woman who does not love you anymore and is kind in the way of someone who has outgrown rage. "You will find that usefulness makes room for other things to arrive unannounced." He reached for something on the table and his hand found it without having to search. "My father used to say that a good door does not worry about who will walk through it, only that it swings when pushed and fits its frame. I thought that banal at the time. I have come to admire doors greatly." Jaime laughed despite himself, and that laugh made him feel more like a man than any fight the past month had offered him the chance to win. The news that spread after that came as news is wont to come, not with trumpets, but in the way men's faces change a little as they look to horizon and then back to the stew in their bowls. There had been a skirmish east of a place with 3 names and no map. Men would tell it one way if they had lost 2 and another if they had lost 3. A party had seen something big and silent move in a thicket and had decided that discretion was the better part of staying alive to decide anything else later. There was a rumor that a woman had been seen in tattered white. There was another rumor that a woman had been heard crying in a voice like a child's. Men do not mind conflicting rumors. They enjoy collecting them. Jaime did not own this news. He shelved it in his head. He went and did his practice. He mended a strap. He stood a turn on the wall. He helped Hobbs' girl peel tough onions that fought back and made them both laugh with astonishment that a vegetable could be legendarily cruel. He spoke with Darren about how hands learn what minds can't hurry and watched the relief settle on the boy's shoulders like a better cloak. He wrote nothing. He did not answer the next letter, though he read it. He burnt it with less ceremony than the first and then ate his bowl of St.Ew and slept without shame. That night the wind turned and the air had a taste in it of old bones. Men slept ill. Even those who snored did it in fits. Jaime woke before dawn to a sound that would not settle into any category he knew. It was not a horn. It was not a scream. It was not, as his mind rifled old drawers for labels, the scraping of a branch or the shifting of the keep's bones. It was a low, resonant thing that seemed to be the negative of a note rather than the note itself, like the memory of a bell rung yesterday vibrating in the ribs today. He lay and listened. The sound did not come again. He said nothing of it, because men who hear things alone should be careful of their tongues. He went to the ranges when the light admitted it. The sergeant was less sharp that morning, as if his mind had tolerated a second guest and was poorer for the hospitality. Jaime's arrows went badly in the second dozen, and then, because he had learned something, he set the bow down and sat and did not force it. He waited. He had not often waited before in his life. He waited until the breathing of the men around him had settled into the rude chorus of small satisfactions. Then he stood and drew and let go, and the arrow made the target admit it had been struck. In the afternoon, Jon Snow approached him for the first time with intention rather than by the drift of men's work. "I'll have need of you for a small thing," he said without preamble. "Only because you have eyes and are not a fool. Those are rarer in combination than you might like," Jaime said, and saw in Jon's mouth the impulse to accept the jest and the decision not to. He did not push it. He followed. They went to the armory where the smith had laid out a map of traps and snares. Jon pointed with a finger that carried a scar across the knuckle that had not fully faded. "This line of snares is a day too long without a man to check it. The men set to it are..." He searched for a word that would not insult. "They are admirable. They are also unlucky. I'd like you to walk it with them and disadvantage fortune." Jaime inclined his head. "I can make small foes unhappy." "Good," Jon said, and something in his eyes eased that had been tight for a week of days. "You'll go at dawn. Dress for boredom. Boredom often needs more courage than panic." They went. Mudge came, and Darren, and Tam with a coil of rope that he could not be parted from because he claimed it had saved his life and therefore had become a superstitious friend. The wind had the clean bite of a day that would snow and then relent. Jaime walked and watched and did his best to be exactly the kind of man Jon had asked for. Not a hero, not an ass, not dramatic, not oblivious. They found 2 snares sprung by foxes and one by nothing at all, and in resetting them he rediscovered the small muscle behind his thumb he had never quite named. He cursed at it, then laughed and apologized to his own hand. It was a good day to be alive. When he returned to the yard near dusk, the wall a bruise against a bruised sky, Bowen Marsh was speaking with Jon. They were not arguing. They were disagreeing in the way men do when neither is fool enough to enjoy it and both know that something must be decided. Jon saw him and beckoned with a quick impatience that had nothing to do with Jaime and everything to do with time. "Tomorrow," Jon said, "there will be a party from Eastwatch with road news and fish if we're lucky. If we're unlucky, only the road news. I'll want you on the wall for the first horn and at the gate for the rest." "There is..." He paused, glanced at Bowen, then back. He had the face of a... "I can do that," Jaime said. It was the only promise he made that day that made sense to his bones. He slept that night without dreams he could remember. The horn woke him. One note. The sound rose pure, as if the cold had brushed it like a musician tuning an instrument. He dressed and took the stairs, and the lift did not complain more than it always did. The top of the wall was the new land. The light was as thin as a hint. A line of figures came from the east as expected. Cotter Pike's men did not waste movement or words. They moved in a way that said you could tell the shape of their day by the shape of their shoulders. They came through and there was fish, a miracle that men will worship more sincerely than most icons. There was road talk. There was the smell of salt that made a boy laugh out loud for no reason other than it reminded him of a day his mother had once taken him to the Tidipools, and he had seen a creature that looked like a hand and discovered it was a living thing and not an abandoned glove. There was talk, too, of men who had gathered in a hall where a fire had not burned hot enough and had made plans that involved other men's bodies and women's nights and the kind of dreams that make you glad you wake. It was ordinary, which is to say it was awful and manageable. He came down from the wall at last and found his feet knew the stairs without complaint. He found Hobbs' girl in the kitchen rolling pastry as if it were a map she could impose roads on. She looked up when he came in and grinned. "Fish pie," she declared, "like my grandmother used to pretend was good for you." "It is good for you," Hobbs said from the stove, mock scandalized. "It gives you belief in the future." Jaime laughed. He laughed more these days, not because the world had become funnier, but because laughter felt like the right size of answer to some of its questions. He took a knife and helped. He did not do it elegantly. It did not matter. The kitchen smelled like hope disguised as oni, awns and flour. That evening he stood just inside the yard while the sky went from iron to slate to a velvet that was not yet night. Men moved past him in the easy hurry of those whose day's labor has found a stopping place. The wall hummed the way it does at that hour, not audibly perhaps, but in the way your teeth think they hear a tune. Jaime flexed the strap that held his glove and felt the pressure of it, as if it were an old friend adjusting a collar for him before he went into a room where he wished to be remembered for the things he had yet to do rather than the things he had already done. He thought of the vow spoken in a cold little grove with a face he had not wanted to believe in watching. He thought of a boy with a knife and a laugh. He thought of an old man in a room of birds who had taught him how to listen. He thought of a woman's letter turning in a small brazier, and the way the smoke had carried a summer down a winter stair and out into air too honest to keep it as his. The horn blew again then, once low and patient. A ranger returning late. Men turned their heads as one does when anyone enters a room and says nothing. They waited. He waited with them, shoulder to shoulder, no more and no less than any man in black. The gate opened. A shape passed through into the lamplight then. A man whose carriage you would have known at a distance if you had spent your life around men who believed corridors should make way. He did not look up at the wall. He did not look left or right to clock the layout of the yard. He walked straight as if he carried a plank from the world behind him into the world in front. He was a little older than the last time Jaime had seen his face, and that was to be expected. The mouth was the same, the particular set that said he tasted his own words before speaking them. He did not speak then. He stopped 6 paces inside the gate and waited while the doors were barred behind him. Only then did he take the yard in at last in the way of a man who made a point of seeming to be the last to know what everyone else had already guessed. He saw Jaime. There is a speed to recognition that has nothing to do with how fast light travels. It is a moral speed, a measure of changes in the soul. The man's eyes did not change. They simply completed their movement to a place they had always known they would land. "Brother?" the man said, not warmly and not coldly, only with the respect all complicated facts deserve. Everything in the yard waited to hear what word Jaime would use next. In the space before speech, in the pocket of air shaped by waiting, Jaime felt at once a dozen versions of himself step forward and clear their throats. The winter allowed the slightest breath. He took it, and then let what came be simple. "Welcome," he said, and the word was as level as he could make it. The gate settled into its hinges like a beast into its den. The night had not yet made up its mind. The road ran both ways. The wall, indifferent and necessary, kept its vigil and would keep it, whatever room any man in it made for the future.